Very good morning to you.
Good morning.
Teacher should do better than that. Always wanted to say that to a group of teachers. Thank you very, very much, Sylvia, to Parkland's College for inviting me back. It's actually the third time that I've been back to the school, and unusually for me, I might add, it's the third time visiting a school that I don't get depressed visiting. And that comes from someone who always used to get depressed, I must tell you, when it was Sunday night and it was school the next day as a student, and something about that Sunday night blues just never ever goes away. But last night I actually felt quite buoyant about what I was going to do here this morning, and it's testimony, I might add, to your beautiful surroundings. Really outstanding surroundings, and the delightful nature of all of those that I have encountered over my few visits here. So I'm delighted to be with you. I'm not quite sure whether you're going to be that delighted to be with me, frankly, by the time I finish talking about South Africa and a little bit about the world, but you know, that's the risk I take in my job. It's a strange job. I provide corporates across South Africa and globally with political and economic analysis of where the world is at, where South Africa is at, where Africa is at for that matter. And I'll do a little bit of that with an emphasis on South Africa with you this morning. So I'd like to say sit back and relax. I'm not quite sure how relaxing it really is going to be. Thank you, that's not the hard stuff. You might need the hard stuff, in fact. You all need the hard stuff, not me. I work with the stuff every single day. So it's time at least to perhaps look at the context, I suppose, of where we are in South Africa and the world, and have a look to see what are some of the nuances and changes that we can expect over the course of this next year and even beyond the next year. So what I want to do with you this morning is give you a brief. I don't just like to talk about South Africa. After all, we do live in a global environment, and there are a number of global issues that are boiling. And when I say boiling, they really are boiling, that I think are just worth mentioning, just in passing. Very important changes that have occurred in the world over the course of the last year, actually over the course of the last few weeks. It's quite remarkable. It's not even the third week in January 2015. And yet I feel as though the world has even changed just since New Year's Day 2015. I don't often get that feeling, but it seems as though a lot has happened in the last 2 weeks globally, and perhaps even within the South African context, which does point us to a very combustible, I believe, for better or for worse, year into 2015. I want to talk obviously about South Africa. My own particular interest is in South African politics, fairly obviously, and I think we're moving into what I call uncharted waters politically in South Africa, with a ruling political party, the ANC, much more fragile than it has ever been before. And when ruling parties across the world become fragile, they become a lot more unpredictable than perhaps they have been in the past. And that's why I tend to call this presentation South Africa Uncharted Waters. We're moving into uncharted waters where we're not quite sure what the ruling party is going to do over the course of the next year or two. I'll talk at some length about the challenges facing South Africa, which, yes, there are political challenges, but actually there are economic challenges, and much of that part of the talk is economic. And finally, a little bit about what I call the messy politics. The messy politics that we are about to enter. An era, I think, of great volatility in our politics, which is not necessarily a bad thing. So I hope at that stage you won't be too exhausted or depressed, and you'll hope to continue your new school year starting this week with some degree of enthusiasm. Now, what can I say about the world over the course of the last few weeks? Well, it's been dominated, of course, by these three words in French. Perhaps some of us who barely ever had attempted French before suddenly have become aware of, well, not only the language, but obviously the issues that had occurred in France only in the course of the last week or 10 days or so. It's been a remarkable 10 days globally as a result of the terrorist actions in France. I always make the point about terrorist actions is we always tend to get, of course, very emotional about certain places in the world where there are heinous deeds or where there are terrorist actions, be they World Trade Center in New York, be they Paris for that matter, cities perhaps some of us are more familiar with, we've been to, we have a personal resonance with. people we know come from these places, so we have more of a connection. Many terrible incidents happen all across the world, I might add, in other parts of the world, and as this was happening in Paris, of course, there were terrible incidents of terrorism happening in Nigeria, which I'll come to as well. So there's been this very, I would say, sort of nasty kickstart to 2015. A kickstart that has seen armed police guard the great symbols of France, the great symbols of liberty, equality, and fraternity, the great symbols of the revolution in France, and the question mark, for that matter, has now become the order of the day, I suppose, in discussion as to whether the civil liberties that really are the mainstay, not just because it's France, which effectively really allowed all of us to enjoy civil liberties post the French Revolution, but whether these civil liberties are going to be allowed or whether they're going to be curtailed in some form or other as terrorism and extremism, of course, rears its head not only in France, but in other parts of Europe and the Western world as well. It's a terrible question that we are all going to have to grapple with in some part over the course of the next number of years, and I suspect it will affect all of us. It's already affected us, in a sense, post 9/11. A number of issues post 9/11 have made us more regulatory bound in the course of the last 14, 15 years or so. Our financial regulations are much more stringent than ever before. Accountability is much more stringent than ever before in reporting, in financial reporting. A lot of that as a result of the flow of funds that occurs to terrorist groups across the world. So you see how these things have an effect in our daily life. We saw a remarkable outpouring of solidarity, though. Amidst the week of terror, we also saw the weekend with a degree of hope. All of these global leaders, some of them relatively small enemies, getting together at least to march in favor of what I suppose, against extremism. It was better that they marched against extremism than did not appear at this particular rally of nearly 2 million people on the streets of Paris at the end of that particular week. So in a sense, again, there was some hope that perhaps this kind of shock to the French system will deliver some better results in terms of policing, understanding the root causes of terrorism and alienation from society, and youth alienation in society, and it's an aspect, I suppose, that comes into your work. You have a different spectrum here in the lovely Parklands campus. But those young people who do not find a place in society, who don't integrate, who don't find a job, who don't find meaning in life, who don't find themselves producing or being productive in society, certainly are the ones susceptible to extremism. This extremism, of course, continued during the course of the last weekend. This is a picture taken yesterday, I might add, not by me, I'm pleased to say, but taken in Niger, in West Africa. Protests against the commemorative edition of Charlie Hebdo, of course, have gone on across many Muslim countries across the world. And in Niger, 10, 15 people were killed in protests against the French and against that French publication. It's not a very happy position in many parts of the world. In Nigeria, as I've said before, we talk about France, we should always remember issues in Nigeria. We had a child suicide bombing, 10-year-old, a 10-year-old girl killed at least 16 in Nigeria in the same week in which those 11 were killed in the Charlie Hebdo and 4 in the kosher supermarket were killed. All happened more or less simultaneously. We do often concentrate on the West. We should equally concentrate on other parts of the world. So that's been a pretty hectic, I would say, start to 2015, and it's enough, I suppose, to make us all feel a little bit down, I suppose. Well, he's not feeling so down as it happens on Barack Obama's feeling a little more smiley, perhaps than he's been in the last while. Politically, of course, he's on the skids, not surprising for a president in his second term of office. US presidents usually run down towards the end of their second term, but the US economy is looking a lot better. So for all of the negativity about the global economy that we've all experienced in the last number of years, well, there's some light at the end of the tunnel, and that light is again being shone by the United States, strangely enough. We all perhaps thought that the US was a little bit dead in the water economically a few years ago, and yet in the last 18 months or so, it's been the United States that has led the Western world into a reasonably decent economic recovery. And I'll put a few charts up on the screen. Don't worry too much about the charts. I don't know if there's I think your principal is going to give you an exam on all of the charts, by the way. She didn't tell me it's coming. but we'll talk about that later. I might give you a few hints if you're nice to me. But the blue line simply indicates US GDP, which is looking a little bit better, just over 3%. The red line indicates the Eurozone, Europe's GDP, which is looking a lot less healthy. And you can see a big gap now emerging between the United States' economy and Europe's economy going forward. So there's good news if you're an American, relatively good news, I should say. If you're European, I might add, there's still an element of doubt about the European recovery. In the last year, the United States stock market has led the world, been the best performing major stock market. That's quite remarkable, given a skepticism for the United States going forward only a few years ago. And you can just see how the US has performed substantially better than any of the other major Western countries, including Japan. In the last year, the US dollar has been the currency that has appreciated the most sharply of the world's major currencies. It's not the Chinese currency that's done particularly well. We all think China is going to perhaps lead the world one day. But for the moment, the US dollar is still the global currency of reserve, and still a currency in which, clearly, investors want to be invested in. And I mean, this is a chart that simply shows the devaluation of the Chinese renminbi, the UK pound, the plural euro there, the Japanese yen, against the US dollar. The US dollar certainly being the one currency that over the course of the last year you wanted to be in. So it's been an interesting year, financially, for the United States. It's clawed itself back. In the last few weeks, we've had another remarkable aspect of our world, plummeting oil prices. I'm not quite sure whether we all quite realize how plummeting oil prices will affect us over the course of the next year. And there is probably some good news in that for all of us. Look at that graph. That's how much oil has plummeted. Now, this morning's oil price per barrel is at $49 a barrel of oil. Now, we will be seeing in South Africa this, the benefits of this. You will be seeing it certainly at the pump. That's where you will see it. You will see substantial price reductions in oil over the course of the next while. But you know, governments don't like to reduce the price of petrol too much. They want to keep a little bit extra for themselves, especially when they are cash strapped, as perhaps our government will be over the course of the year. So despite the fact that we see these fancy graphs that show these dramatic falls in that barrel of Brent crude oil, in the end you may not see exactly the same proportionate fall in your tank of petrol when you go to fill up your car, but you will see a meaningful decrease in that, and that, I suppose, is to be welcomed. It's great for a country like South Africa. It's not great, though, for some countries of the world who are reliant upon high oil prices to balance their budgets. Which are the countries that are going to be most affected by a low oil price? Most negatively affected? Well, a country like Venezuela, who needs oil to be at nearly $160 per barrel in order to pay for all the various social services that that country has unrolled for its people. Nigeria needs a very high oil price to at least maintain some semblance of government governance. If that oil price continues to languish at $50 or $60 a barrel, that's half what Nigeria needs to balance its budget. Well, the growth of Nigeria as a country, which we all expect to continue, could very well be hampered by that. The big question mark this coming year on the price of oil and which country will be affected the most to me is Russia. Russia clearly is dependent upon a relatively high oil price, again, to keep its economic system relatively viable. And as we know, Russia is deeply cash-strapped at the moment, partially as a result of economic sanctions introduced by the West, as a result of Mr. Putin's desire to expand his borders back to the old Soviet Empire days. So these are the countries that are not going to do too well out of a falling oil price. This graph, interestingly enough, I won't go into too many details here, shows you which countries of the world are expected to do really well as a result of falling oil prices. Those countries that are reliant upon oil imports, fairly obviously, who don't have their own oil, fairly obviously, those are the countries that really will derive the great benefits. And in fact, it's a very interesting study by Oxford Economics and simply shows that the Philippines which is an island nation, uses a lot of oil to transport people and goods and services from one island to another. Thousands of islands make up the Philippine archipelago. As those of you that teach geography, I hope they do teach geography, by the way, here at Barclays. Obviously, people have forgotten the map of the world. That you show maps and you show all those interesting maps that are now coming up. I think they're excited about maps, by the way. But just interesting on this particular study by Oxford Economics, South Africa is shown to be the third country in the world to derive most economic benefit from a lower oil price, because we import oil, and we therefore could see our input costs in this country dropping, making us a little bit more competitive again globally. And hallelujah to that, because we really need to be a little bit more competitive. We are not competitive when it comes to other input costs. Our electricity costs are high, as we know, and going to get higher. Our labor costs in South Africa are high and probably going to get higher. So we've got to make it up on something else if we are to be competitive globally. And if oil falls, then at least there's a chance in South Africa that we could see some renewed investment interest in our country. There are going to be some winners and losers in this world over the course of the next year or so. Our poor friends in Europe, we should also, thank your lucky stars in a sense that you're not in Europe, despite some of your friends and family who might have immigrated to parts of Europe. That European economy is looking not so good. On life support, I suppose, in some countries, there's still question marks about Greece having an election over the course of the next while. All sorts of issues cropping up. The Swiss have meddled in their currency in the last week. The Europeans are not out of the wood in terms of an economic settlement which has eluded them over the course of the last few years or so. So, globally, as we move into 2015, and we can see South Africa in the global context here as well, we can see which countries are expected to grow, which countries are expected to contract in terms of their economy, in terms of gross domestic product, GDP, sum of all goods and services in the economy. And you can just see that we are expected here, the dark blue indicates the forecasts for 2015. South Africa's GDP is expected to decline by nearly 1% or so. That's not good news, fairly. Obviously, I hope that may not be as bad as that if a low oil price helps us, and if we have a degree of labour stability into this year, this might be offset just a little bit. But still, we are looking at lower growth. But then so is most of the rest of the world looking at lower growth. The Eurozone looking at lower growth. Brazil, a great growing economy over the course of the last 10 years or so, looking at a substantial decline in growth. Much worse than us in South Africa and Russia, of course. That real problem area. When countries flag economically, they can make, of course, some unpredictable foreign policy sorties, as we know the Russians are capable of doing. So adding in a degree of volatility into the world, especially when it comes to the global geopolitical machinations of Mr. Vladimir Putin. Even the Chinese are going to see a slight reduction in growth over the course of the next year. The one bright spot, other than the United States, by the way, is India. India's growth looks as though it's going to be a little bit more solid than last year, and that's good news for 1.2 billion Indians who are looking for a degree of recovery in their economy. The African story, I must tell you, is still looking good. Still looking good. I do a lot of presentations on Africa. A lot of clients want to know about Africa's economic fortunes going forward. This is one of my favorite maps. Some of you might use it in your classes. If you don't, please do. But perhaps it's not so important here in South Africa. I use this map when I go and lecture to students in the United States. And I've just been in the United States lecturing to students, and it's very important to show Americans maps. I must tell you. Insulting the American audience here. Americans sometimes not quite sure about that. And when you show them a map like that and just show them how big Africa is, because that's what this map obviously wants to portray, how big the continent is, you can fit the United States landmass into Africa and China and India and all of Eastern Europe and UK and Madagascar. Americans look at this and they say, wow. So the African continent itself, from a growth perspective, is still looking relatively healthy, I must tell you. Africa's growth story has been good for the last 10 years or so, and notwithstanding security considerations in Nigeria and in Kenya, and in some other parts of the continent, and there are some serious related security issues that are creeping in to our discourse about Africa's growth into the future. I'm still quite bullish about Africa, and we here at the Southern Tip can take advantage of that going forward. There is expected on this continent to be nearly 300 million people who will move into the middle classes over the course of the next year or two. That's a huge amount of people who will now have some degree of discretionary income. They'll be able to spend money on goods and services that are not absolutely essential for their survival tomorrow. So they can go to that new Mr. Price store that's opened up in Lagos or in Accra, for example, and buy another skirt or another dress, something they didn't really need, but they have the ability now to do discretionary income. Isn't discretionary income wonderful for all of us to buy stuff we don't really need? And it's being experienced now, perhaps for the first time, by tens of millions now of Africans on this continent. It's the reason why my retail clients are chomping at the bit to get into Africa, notwithstanding the difficulties of operating on the continent. From an economic point of view, again, we in South Africa, along with West Africa, parts of East Africa, are now looking to really attract heavy investments, foreign direct investment, usually in infrastructure, port infrastructure, airports, roads, railways, logistics. All of this critically important for the continent, and there's heavy investment coming in to the continent from a variety of sources. South African companies are taking great advantage of this and of themselves moving across the African continent to provide specialist goods and services. So, the global environment is a mixed bag. It's a mixed bag of terror, of excitement, of revival. The South African environment, I suppose, is equally a mixed bag. I must tell you, a mixed bag of issues pertaining to leadership, issues pertaining to politics, issues pertaining to, of course, economic performance. Now, the last year, in the South African context, saw it was an annus horribilis, I suppose, for the ANC. A remarkably bad year for the party, emotionally, I suppose, as a result of never-ending scandals, in particular the scandal surrounding Nkandla. Despite the Nkandla scandal, though, the ANC ran a very effective election campaign, and President Zuma led that campaign, certainly in terms of his persona. He led the campaign, he was the front face of the ANC. The ANC didn't hide him, and 62% of South Africans went and voted for the ANC in that election. So as much as we would want to deride, of course, President Zuma, as my friend cartoonist Sapiro often does, or in fact all the time does in his cartoons, South Africans by and large still supported the political party, the ANC, that had as its head Jacob Zuma. But here's where we run, of course, into a series of questions about South African politics that really are new for all of us. And here's where we run into the uncharted waters in South Africa. The ANC did get 62% of the vote, absolutely got 62%. Was a pretty good result for a political party that had been in power for 20 years. Very few political parties across the world in power for 20 years. Well, very few can keep in power for 20 years, I must tell you. But to still get over 60% of the support when you've been in power for so long is an achievement, and the ANC should be pretty proud that it managed to achieve it in a free and fair election as we had. But a lot of South Africans didn't vote in the election, I must tell you. A lot of South Africans who were registered, young people in particular, didn't vote. Some of them didn't register to vote. Some of them did register to vote, didn't bother to turn out at the polls on polling day. And if we take an analysis of the total amount of eligible voters in South Africa and the support for the ANC, we can see that the ANC only received about 35% of all South Africans. A lot of South Africans simply didn't vote, didn't cast their ballot. So we're moving into a position in South Africa where a lot of South Africans don't participate in politics for a variety of reasons. If you don't participate in politics, you can become alienated from the political process. Very obviously, you can become disinterested, or you can perhaps begin to express yourself politically in ways other than at the ballot box, in violent protest for that matter, if you don't participate. And there's a danger of our lower participation rate in politics, that this could lead to greater degrees of social unrest into the future. I don't think there's been any direct correlation of that as yet, but it's an issue that I will certainly watch. When you look at the stats and you see how many South Africans don't participate in the normal political activity that we offer our citizens, and we offer our citizens a lot politically, I must tell you, in this country, then I think we must watch this into the future. The second issue, which prompts me to suggest that we're moving into uncharted waters politically, is that despite the ANC winning 62% of the vote, which sounds pretty good, most of you will know that in Gauteng in particular, the ANC actually lost a lot of support. In fact, the ANC support declined by nearly 300,000 votes in Gauteng alone. Nearly 300,000 people there, mainly black South Africans, decided not to vote for the ANC. Many of those voted for the DA, who increased their tally in Gauteng by nearly 400,000 votes, and many voting for the EFF, whose Gauteng figure was nearly 500,000 votes. So you can see now in our political discourse a new volatility. There is a willingness on the part of a proportion of former ANC voters to consider voting for another political party. We've never seen this in South African politics before, and I think it plays into a new, more competitive political era that's going to be coming. There's President Zuma, of course, probably at his most relaxed, I think, when he's in his kingdom, I suppose, when he's in northern KwaZulu-Natal, in Kandla. I always get the feeling when you watch the president, that's really where he's comfortable, and that's where his real support base does lie, I must tell you statistically. His support base, though, in urban areas in South Africa is shrinking. And here's something we've never seen also before in South African politics. The red line indicates the ANC support in rural areas. And you can see the line is pretty solid. ANC is still picking up a lot of rural votes. But the blue line indicates the ANC support in urban areas, in our cities. And the ANC support here in urban areas is certainly declining quite dramatically. And South Africa is becoming a much more urbanized country, as we know. Thousands move every day from rural to our urban areas looking for work and a better life. When they get out of those little cocoons that they've been living in rural areas and come to the Khayelitsas and Shoshanguis, and they come to the Alexandras, and they come to all the major township areas of South Africa, they get exposed to a much broader range of political thought, intellectual thought for that matter, that they never had when they were living in rural Limpopo or rural Mpumalanga for that matter. So South Africa is changing substantially as a result of urbanization, and our political expression is going to change also as a result of urbanization, and it also moves us into uncharted water. There's going to be more political competition, there's going to be more discussion amongst former ANC voters about different ways to express themselves politically at the ballot box. Point number 3 on why we're moving into this uncharted waters territory is to show that loss of support in the major urban areas for the ANC. In the metropolitan areas of Johannesburg, the ANC managed only to get a 52% vote in this last election. In fact, they barely won control of the metropolitan area of Johannesburg based on this last election. In fact, the ANC didn't win the vote in Tshwane, in the metropole of Tshwane, Pretoria, where they got less than 50% of the vote. And in Port Elizabeth and the Nelson Mandela Bay Metro, the ANC also failed to get more than 50% of the vote. This moves us into real uncharted waters over the course of the next 18 months, because all of us will go to vote again in local government elections, which are coming up next year, when we will vote for municipalities. And the ANC is going to battle to maintain overall control over the city of Pretoria, over the city of Johannesburg, over Nelson Mandela Bay and Port Elizabeth. Isn't that remarkable? That we can now project, in fact, electorally, that it's no dead cert that the ANC will win outright those big metros, and they might need coalition partners in order to govern. That's uncharted waters for us in South Africa, and again, makes for a much more competitive and combustible political process that I believe is necessary to take us to the next stage of our political maturity. The personalities and faces in our politics are changing and changing dramatically as well. These two gentlemen, well, we all know Mr. Malema. He's been on the scene for some time, I suppose. Mr. Maimane and the DA, a relative newcomer to national politics. But again, new younger faces who have become quite vocal, they've become pretty household names over the course of the last year or two. They themselves are changing the face of South African politics. Mr. Maimane has got a tough act. He's got it rough, I must tell you. He has to attempt now to take over, in a sense, the mantle of Helen Zille, who looks as though she's pulling back from the front of the DA, less of a national profile, handing more of it over to him, and he really has to perform. He has to perform in Parliament, and he's done a relatively good job, I must say, over the course of the last year, but his job has been aided and abetted, I might add, by the introduction of the EFF, and this new colour into the South African Parliament. Had it not been, perhaps, for the very vocal style of politics from Malema and the EFF, had it not been for this more confrontational approach that we've seen in politics, I wonder whether Mr. Maimane or the DA would have similarly found their voice. You will remember the DA found its voice towards the end of the last parliamentary session on the back of the whole parliamentary scene being changed so fundamentally by the EFF. So the EFF have perhaps done the DA a big favour by changing the culture within our parliament. And again, I don't like disruption. I tend to like rules and regulations. I think parliament needs an air of decorum, all of the stuff. But frankly, we needed some sort of shake-up in what had become a very rigid and relatively unsatisfying public forum. And on the basis of that, I think one has to give credit to Malema for going as far as he did with this, but certainly also say that the DA finally seem to have found their voice. We are going to witness, of course, over the course of the next few weeks, the build-up to the State of the Nation address by President Zuma. You can imagine President Zuma is not sitting pretty and is not particularly relaxed as he contemplates what's going to happen on February the 12th, I think it is, in his State of the Nation address. The EFF have already indicated that they may well disrupt the proceedings if Zuma does not answer the issues of whether he's going to pay back any money on Nkandla or not, and it doesn't look like the President is going to do anything remotely close to that. So we could see more of this when it comes to the parliamentary scene in the next few weeks. Watch this space, but it's changing the nature of our politics. It's making South Africans see that, firstly, the parliamentary chamber is again at the forefront of our political discourse, which is very necessary. It's holding government to account, which is very necessary, and it is really putting on show and showing up none other than the President and perhaps even other senior office bearers. In fact, Baleka Mbeti's future perhaps has already been negatively affected by her inability to effectively manage Parliament in those tempestuous sessions at the end of last year. So politically, there's enough uncharted waters, I think, to shipwreck many a ship, but I say bring it on. Economically, there are many challenges for South Africa. Well, we managed to, I think, overcome one of those challenges there on the rugby scene, but we hope it's not short-lived, as some of our successes seem to be. Economically, we're in a very rough space. But at the same time, we do some things remarkably well in South Africa. And we are world leaders when it comes to some aspects of what we deliver. And I want to show you very briefly here. It's a graph, a chart. Something indicates it's in two parts, very obviously. And the little part on top here just indicates how we are ranked globally. The World Economic Forum, which is a very useful think tank, and in fact they're meeting at the moment in Davos in Switzerland. They put out a series of very interesting documents, but in particular, every 18 months or so, they put out a document that analyzes 148 countries across the world called the Global Competitiveness Report. So if you want to see how your country is doing, stack up against 148 other countries, take a look at this report. It's excellent, and I certainly urge perhaps your grade 12 students to, even other students for that matter, to start to engage this kind of report, because it's a great geography lesson as well as a good economics background into what works and doesn't work in a country. Now, the Global Competitiveness Report, the last one, has shown that South Africa ranks pretty well when it comes to a variety of aspects of our economy. For example, we are number 3 in the world when it comes to the soundness of our banks. Our banking sector, financial services sector in this country, absolutely outstanding. And that's great because the world has been in some degree of difficulty over the soundness and effectiveness and efficiency of banks over the course of the last number of years. So we are number 10 in the world on the strength of investor protection. We are number 1 in the world when it comes to the strength of auditing and reporting in our private, in our corporate sector. Where are we? The regulation of the Johannesburg, the JSE, the Securities Exchange, number 1 in the world. We rank pretty well. And we need to be proud of those achievements. But of course, to spoil your morning, here is where we are not so well ranked. And I try to play it fair, but it's only so fair that you can play when you have a look at the analysis. Because 148 countries ranked across the world. If I like the way there, just from your perspective, you guys are responsible, basically responsible for changing this graph over the course of time. Take a look at the second one at the bottom. We are 148 in the world on the quality of maths and science. The outcomes of the quality of maths and science taught in our schools. 148 in the world. What can I say about it? You can talk about it. Overall, on the quality of our educational system, we are 146 in the world out of 148 countries. And you can just see, I must tell you, 2 years ago, on the previous survey, we were on quality of maths and science. We were 147 in the world out of 148. And somebody in the audience stood up afterwards and asked me a question. He said, "Daniel, what was the bottom country? What was the bottom country?" Now, I wasn't quite sure what the bottom country was because I don't have all 148 in my head, but I went back to have a look. And I found out that it was Yemen in the Gulf, which was the bottom. Now, what seems to have happened is that, in fact, the person in the audience said to me, well, maybe we need to send someone to Yemen. We need to send someone to Yemen to help them improve their position. Clearly, we must have done that. And Yemen had improved their position, and unfortunately for us, as sad as it might be, maybe after that I must tell you, we are bottom of the pile. And I think you can, this is not an issue of my expertise, but you can yourself, and it's a useful exercise for you to analyze the trick results that have just come out now, and to have a look at I'll mention one to that in a moment. But education clearly lacking in our ability to be globally competitive in terms of our ability to make for a new generation of young people to enter a very difficult and increasingly competitive global environment. I must just say the other key issue here at this finding is we are also bottom of the world in terms of labour-employee cooperation. Our labour relations regime in South Africa is indeed struggling. It's on life support, for that matter. And again, if our labour relations regime doesn't improve, we are looking at a high degree of economic stagnation as well. It's not surprising that HIV prevalence puts us also amongst the lowest ranked countries in the world. Crime and violence also clearly doesn't help us at all. And again, issues relating to wage determination, again, which relates back to our labour regime, we perform poorly as well. So, on some aspects we perform well, on other aspects South Africa really is falling behind. And that's why I suppose in educational issues you get this kind of headline creeping into our press, although I have to say some of the headlines that are written in our press themselves might be written by some individuals who haven't perhaps passed any kind of teaching. Just quickly, because I haven't really had time to look at the analysis of the current matric results, but this particular figure, which is not an unusual figure, and we've seen this figure before in the last few years in South Africa, indicates, of course, one of my chief concerns. Again, for all the fancy analysis and academic stuff that we can discuss about kids and learners and students and whatever you want to talk about. The stat shows that our students are simply not completing their schooling. That's all there is to it. They might enroll 12 years earlier for grade 1, but 12 years later, barely 50% of them are in fact getting any kind of matric, or at least completing their matric. In fact, it's less than 50%. So along the way, we are creating a nation of dropouts, of school leavers and dropouts, who are not even getting basic schooling. And that's making us less competitive globally as well, and it adds to these very high levels of unemployment, youth unemployment in South Africa, which is running at anywhere around 50% of young South Africans are unemployed at any one time in the country. 50% of young South Africans, the overall rate of unemployment in South Africa, anywhere between 25% official figures and about 35%, which includes what one calls discouraged workers, those who have just given up looking for work altogether. So the South African economy, of course, will take strain as a result of being less globally competitive, and of course as a result of just not growing the skills base in order to develop niche industries that are needed to take us into the future. The big industries that have maintained our own economy in the last 50, 100, 300 years for that matter, are also under strain as we speak. South African mining has been an industry that has built this country, but as you can see, it has a declining role as a contributor to our economy, and it has been in decline now for some time. There are all sorts of reasons why mining is in decline in South Africa. Again, labor problems add to that, productivity issues, above average wage demands, power shortages, of course, add to a stagnant mining industry, complexities, over-regulation, ownership issues, security of tenure into the future, land-related issues. All of these issues continue to plague this industry, and I might add, on top of all of this, the world is becoming much more competitive. Everything is becoming much more competitive. For big investors looking to invest, well, they can invest in South Africa, but then they'll say, oh, wait a moment, your labor regime doesn't look too good, or your power utility doesn't look too healthy. Maybe we're going to go to Canada, or maybe we'll go to Peru, or maybe we're going to go to Brazil. The world is much more competitive. And sometimes I think, again, our powers that be in South Africa really need to understand the competitive nature to everything that we do. It's not just mining that has seen a decline. Our manufacturing production in South Africa has also taken something of a knock. We never returned to the pre-recession days when our manufacturing industry was at least relatively healthy. And again, we haven't seen enough investment in manufacturing, domestic or foreign investment in manufacturing, for similar reasons that have plagued the mining industry. One of our big problems in South Africa is an increasingly expensive workforce, I might add. In the country, we are no longer a cheap country in which to employ or manufacture goods. We are now almost as expensive as Korea when it comes to unit labor costs, by the way. You can just see the guys who are really cheap are still Malaysia, Taiwan, Indonesia, China, Poland, in Eastern Europe. But you can see it's not cheap anymore to come to South Africa. And again, this makes us less competitive when it comes to foreign investors looking to come into South Africa. So it's no surprise, therefore, that our GDP languishes. We can see that our GDP is just there about 1.5%, by the way, at the end of last year, the last quarter, excuse me. Again, our GDP in South Africa hopefully will get to 2% this year, but it's not good enough. We need to have a GDP of 5 or 6% in South Africa, at least, in order to kickstart our growth. Now, my good friend Silke created one of the funnier cartoons that I've seen recently about Eskom, the renaming of Eskom's megawatt park with a new microwatt park. I must tell you, I laughed, and I continue to laugh when I see this particular slide, so I thought I would put it in. Indeed, another, of course, impediment to growth in South Africa. Government in South Africa has been getting bigger. It's been a great place to be employed if you happen to be in government service. Government has locked more people into its service in all variety of forms. The private sector hasn't necessarily hired in South Africa, but government has a government payroll getting substantially bigger in the country. If your government payroll is bigger, you guys are going to have to pay more taxes. I'm going to have to pay more taxes. government has got to get cash from somewhere. And we're going to see issues related to tax over the course of the next few months become very important for all of us, and watch new tax proposals that are going to come on the scene. Government needs money. 16.5 million South Africans are now reliant on social income grants every single month. And we're rolling these out to more categories than ever before. It's a lot of people who require a lot of cash. And I'm the first person to say that there needs to be a safety net and a cushion for poor South Africans, absolutely. But at the same time, you need to grow your economy, you need to expand your tax base, you need to up that GDP so you can afford to do this with relative ease and without pain on the entire society. And I think that's the question, an uncharted water that we are going into. Government debt is increasing. More South Africans receive grants than are currently employed, and we've got to maintain the system into the future. And there's uncharted waters as to how we're going to get that right. And again, just quickly to show you here, just social grants, I happen to be in favor of social grants, but there's the unintended consequence of social grants. People, an interesting survey that was done, people who are reliant upon social grants are the least likely to look for a job or accept a job if offered to them. Social grants, in a sense, can make you complacent, of course. You get the check at the end of the month. And in this survey that was done very recently by the South African Institute of Race Relations, it clearly showed that those who were reliant on social grants were less likely to accept the job if offered than those who were reliant on their own savings or on other people's income in the household or on odd jobs. Most people who relied upon odd jobs, 64%, said they would accept a job if offered. But only 11% who were reliant upon social grants and welfare said they would accept a job if offered. So there really has to be a rethink in South Africa on exactly how this issue of social grants and a willingness to work or to try to get work is developed in our country. It's a vexed and difficult question. So, look, there are a lot of challenges. Time for action? Absolutely. We've had the action plan. I must tell you, the action plan is the National Development Plan. You know, if I talk about this plan once more, I will pull the remaining 3 strands of hair out of the top of my head. There's 400 pages in this tome of a document. You know, have a look at it. It's, you know, it's great as a doorstop in a windy part of Cape Town. In all seriousness, it's a really good document. You know, in all seriousness, if I look at the country, I would say, listen guys, this is the plan, let's implement it, let's do it now, forget about everything else. But there are political constraints in adopting and accepting this particular plan. It's probably the best thing to come out of government. I don't like all of it, but it's the best thing I've seen in the last 20 years. The plan itself, of course, is government policy. It's been accepted as such, and the ANC ran on this campaign of the plan in the last election. But is anybody really trying to implement this? I'm not so sure. They're discussing how to implement this, no doubt. But these are 2 good individuals. Not all government, I might add, is tardy or uninspiring. Both these 2 individuals, reasonably good, reasonably talented, and I think can make a difference in South Africa. Mr. Kanyako, who's now been appointed to head up a critical government department, very important, new good individuals. Good cabinet ministers in South Africa who actually can make a difference. A very good new deputy president in South Africa who potentially may well take over the reins of office into the next few years, who certainly can make a difference, who can bring us out of the rather muddy, uncharted waters that we are in currently. But the big daddy of them all, the ANC, is really the fragile element that I think retards our progress into the new South Africa. The components of the ANC, the tripartite alliance, the trade unions themselves, the infighting policy clashes, personality clashes, and of course the electoral fragility of the ANC are preventing the ruling party from making the necessary tough policy decisions that we need going forward. As trade unions become more militant, looking for higher levels of wages, again, this prevents a degree of competitiveness. It adds in a degree of labor unrest. into the mix that again prevents our growth rate from attaining necessary levels. It's all very well to demand a minimum wage of 12,500 rand, and when the mining company gives in and gives you the 12,500 rand, you say that's great and wonderful and you cheer, but then a year later the same mining company lays off tens of thousands of workers because they simply can't afford to pay them these elevated rates. This aspect and this cycle that we've seen in South Africa clearly an impediment to doing business. But at the heart of it all, with a fragile ANC, is this relationship. The relationship between the state, the labour union movements, and the private sector. A relationship that's been severely and negatively hampered over the course of the last number of years. A relationship that has deteriorated. And again, until this relationship is improved, until Labour learns to trust the private sector and the private sector learns to respect the state and the cycle improves, we will continue to see a policy malaise in South Africa. Mixed signals, one day sent to be pro-business, one day sent to attack business. Unless that triumvirate, that tripod is improved, we will continue to see roads and plans and programs in South Africa just curve back on themselves. So we enter a period of uncharted waters where the big house, of course, remains a critical issue for all of us politically. The big house has given President Zuma a pretty dismal year, I must tell you. And in fact, Ms. Madonsela has, of course, not helped the President's headache over the course of the last while. The question really is as to whether President Zuma will continue in office unabated until the end of his term. For the moment, and when I look at politics this year, it looks to me as though the ANC is going to cling on to President Zuma, certainly for the foreseeable future. There are heirs apparent waiting in the wings. These two in particular, I would argue, are the front runners. Ramaphosa, to me, is still more of a front runner than Nkosazana Dlamini Zuma there, who he's hugging there. I think Ramaphosa will increasingly play an important role, possibly even as the de facto president, perhaps as deputy president, but in effectiveness, it's going to be Ramaphosa. You've seen already Ramaphosa being handed big issues like the state of South Africa's state-owned enterprises. Good luck with getting Eskom and South African Airways up and running for that matter. So, it's uncharted. It's more competitive than ever before, and our politics is going to be more contested than ever before. It's more fluid than ever before, because the ANC may not win overall control of Johannesburg, of Tshwane, of Electoral, as they have had before. It's more combative than ever before. There's going to be more animosity between political parties and movements. Don't be afraid of it. It's all part, I believe, of a maturation process of our politics, away from the last 20 years of post-revolutionary fervour to a much more real era in South African politics. It's less certain. Many people I speak to in business like certainty. They don't mind, even if they don't like the ANC, they just want to know that the ANC is going to rule. My view is that less certainty is actually much more beneficial for all of us in South Africa in terms of the political process going forward. We need a shake-up. You can't have the same political party rule time and time again. It creates inertia, it creates corruption, it creates cronyism, as we know all too well. We are going to see ideology play much more of an important role in our politics as the economic troubles boil to a point where different ideological options are going to be proposed by different political parties and formations, including even a new trade union-based political party that could take even more support away from the ANC. I'm not afraid of that. I think it's good for politics. I say bring it on. I think we've seen in this last election 10 months ago, the last election of the old order of things. We're about to enter a new order of things in South Africa. For President Zuma, well, the ANC has got a key question. Do they keep their power intact, or do they risk the unity of the alliance for better performance, for introducing policies that might be a tough sell to their alliance partners? That's the choice that Zuma is likely to have to be facing. There are dangers over the course of the next year or so. as the ruling party becomes more skittish, more nervous about its future, it can become more authoritarian in its efforts to restore its own control. We've seen efforts of that in the last while to perhaps rein in newspaper freedoms, freedoms of expression, and freedom of speech. We've seen the controversy surrounding Max Dupree and many other major journalists unfold over the course of the last year. There's a nice sort of political academic term for this. It sort of relates to institutions of the state or institutions in our society are captured. They're captured by the state or captured by the ruling party. And there may well be some sort of slow, incremental attempt to capture as much media as possible. It's not easy today because media goes online, it goes elsewhere. You may be able to capture a newspaper house, but really, press sales are down. Where are people getting their news? They're getting it from Twitter and from Facebook. And millions of South Africans engage on Facebook and Twitter every single day. There is a danger, of course, there is a danger that our political rhetoric can become locked into some sort of populist, racial kind of ethos or dimension. A very unfortunate kind of rhetoric that, of course, is often practiced by all sides on the political equation, from Steve Hofmeyr, for that matter, to President Zuma. And we've seen an increase in this. I think there's a danger of this, and it takes great leadership, and it should take great leadership from the President to reinstill the nation building that perhaps has rather come unstuck since the Nelson Mandela days. The third key warning light for me will be on issues of land. Land acquisition, land nationalization, land expropriation is a critical issue in South Africa, and a very emotive one, fraught with all sorts of nasty consequences. I do a lot of work in the agricultural sector. A lot of my clients are farmers, and you can imagine my most difficult clients ever are farmers. That's one group I get nervous about talking to, I must tell you. Watch out for issues related to land over the course of this year. Any attempt to bypass the South African Constitution to take land without paying fair value will be an issue to flag and to watch into the future. Although Zuma has said this will not happen in the way I've suggested. Let's wait to see if it happens in an orderly fashion during the course of the year. So, I don't know whether it's a positive or a negative analysis. There's a lot of issues that we need to get right here. We're standing on the cusp of some very difficult decisions that we have to make, and indeed, we are setting precedents, I believe, for our strength as a society, both domestically and internationally over the course of the next number of years by what happens this year in South Africa. Ultimately, we're all here. It doesn't matter whether your hero is Jan van Riebeeck, or whether your hero is Chris Hahn, or whether your hero is Albert Lutuli. We're all in this boat, we've all got to make this boat work, frankly. Keep calm, everybody. Carry on as you were. The rest of the world is not an easy place to operate in either. The Eurozone is indeed in economic difficulties. You don't want to be in Greece at the moment. Well, you don't really want to go here to Ankara, which is the home of the Turkish Parliament. You think things are tough in the South African Parliament? Take a little visit from the visitors' gallery and look to see how those parliamentarians attack each other on the floor of Parliament. We might get to that in 2 weeks' time, so keep watching the parliamentary channels. That's a good news, I must tell you. You don't want to go to the Parliament in Kiev, in Ukraine, another emotional Ukraine, I must tell you. It's not so bad here in South Africa. The world still likes South Africa, I must tell you, from an investment point of view. In July, the South African Treasury issued nearly $2 billion of long-term bonds, and this issue was 3 times oversubscribed on the day. So clearly there's still a view that South Africa offers security for investment and positive rates of return into the future. Our corporate world in the country remain outstanding in terms of their global reach. You've just seen how a great store like Woolworths have bought into another great store in Australia, David Jones. Again, testimony to outstanding management, outstanding private sector initiatives coming out of South Africa. We're not down and out at all for that matter. And again, just because I like maps and I'll end with this particular map, we are on the cusp of a continent of Africa that will show great growth over the course course of the next number of years, decades, for the rest of our lives for that matter, the population demographics of this world are shifting. And they're going to be shifting to the African continent. They're going to be people here on this continent crying out for goods and services, for Mr. Prices, for ShopRites, for Parkland's college branches across this particular continent, I can tell you. And you know, when you look at those opportunities that afford us all in business in South Africa, oh, there's a pretty interesting future on that score. Let's hope government also participates in assisting us get that business into the future. My friends, thank you very much for listening to me. I hope that you've enjoyed it. It will be a fasten your seatbelt time for all of us. But when I get into my vehicle, I want to fasten our seatbelt. It's necessary, and I think we should fasten our seatbelts into a time of great turbulence, volatility, but equally a time of great opportunity and excitement and maturation for all of us. Thank you very much for listening.